Welcome to Community Liberation Podcast, a podcast about applying revolutionary theory to revolutionary practice. My name is Geraldo, and I am an organizer with Community Liberation Programs, or CLP. CLP is a multinational scientific socialist mass organization based in the San Francisco Bay Area. We currently run decolonization programs in Oakland and San Francisco, such as our Oakland Chinatown grocery distribution program and our SF Youth Street Medic program. We also regularly hold public political education events and classes. To learn more about our programs, you can follow us on Instagram at Community Liberation Programs, and you can support our Buy Me a Coffee and Give Butter in the show notes below. This podcast and other podcasts that we also do, as well as decolonization programs, are for the people and 100% funded by grassroots donations like yours. All right, so for today's episode, we will be going over chapter one of Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon, as well as touch on some of the things that we were kind of discussing in our reading group that we've been putting on. So currently we are two reading groups in, and we just started covering the first chapter. And so we're going to be going into that a little bit more. But before I get started, I'm going to introduce my co-hosts for today. So I'll pass it on to Raju.
Hi, everyone. My name is Raju. My pronouns are she and they. I am an organizer with community liberation programs. I am one of the facilitators of the Wretched of the Earth reading group. This is my second or third time reading Wretched and meditation, so it's been really great to see the text through a new lens. And I'm very excited to chat with y'all today about how the reading has been going and on the first chapter.
Thank you. And we're also have Dob, who was on the previous podcast as well. Dob, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hey y'all, it's Dob again, and he, him pronouns. And yeah, I'm just happy to be here to discuss chapter one. Gonna be a good discussion.
Cool. Let's get it started. So chapter one is called Concerning Violence. And there's a lot going on with concerning violence. We discussed just a little bit in our reading group this last Sunday, but we also want to touch on some of the things that we may have not had actually some time to touch on. So, some of the things we want to kind of touch a little bit more on, because folks were really interested in hearing more about, was kind of this concept of the compartmentalized world. And so I guess we can get kind of started on that and then kind of see where the discussion goes after that. So the compartmentalized world that Fanon talks about, he talks about it kind of in the first aspects of the chapter about how there is a compartmentalized world where there is the world of the settler or the colonizer and the colonized. And the settler's world or the colonizer's world is this pristine, well kept, clean, um, metropolitan world that has access to, the riches that kind of were, stolen from the colonized world as well. And he kind of shows a opposite of that, which was the colonized world, which looks more into the kind of aspects of like, the squalor, the kind of people living on top of each other. No one cares if where you live or die or where you're born. It's just a world where you're kind of, completely immiserated. And I think that is something that, there's a lot of very contemporary examples of this. And I think that, it is something that Fanon has a lot of dives a little bit deeper into, and I think it kind of sets the stage for some of the theories that he kind of talks about with regards to revolutionary violence and kind of the revolutionary program that he wants to see in a colonized society. So I'm going to open up the floor if anyone wants to take on, their thoughts on this, the compartmentalized world, as well as, any things that kind of come out, in the current day.
One thing that I really like that Fanon does throughout Wretched is when he's speaking of a specific time and place, he also talks about the version of the colonizer and the native that exists in that moment. And I think that creates a sort of continuity throughout the book where we're seeing the transformation of the land and the people happening together. And I think at this point, when he's talking about the world that you just described, Geraldo, he also describes the residents of the town of the colonized, right? So, as people who dream of possession, of having what the colonizers have, they look upon the colonizers with a state of envy and anger. And at this point in the stage of kind of decolonization or pre-decolonization, there's still this desire to take what the settler or to be in the settlers' place, to have their position as opposed to evicting the settler altogether. So I thought it's very important that Fanon kind of brings those ideas of place and personhood together when he talks about this Manichaean colonial world.
Yeah, I think when Fanon talks about the compartmentalization, he really brings into focus a few things. So the first one I think is that, as Raju alluded to, the structure of colonial society is not just ideological, it's spatially structured, which I think is very important for us to understand, right? It's not as if, there's just this ideological discrimination against the native. They inhabit entirely separate worlds, right? So they build very separate um worldviews. And I think the second part is, so Fanon states explicitly that the zone where the natives live are not complementary to the zone where the settlers live. And the emphasis is on not complementary, right? So it's not so it's when I think about this, I think about the yin yang diagram, right? You have antagonistic contradictions, an antagonistic dialectic versus a non-antagonistic dialectic. And Fanon clearly places this into the antagonistic category, right? They're not, these compartments aren't two parts of a whole, so to speak.
Yeah, I think you kind of touch on a good point. It's like, it's more than just the superstructural aspects of it. It's also like the land. And yeah, he definitely touches on like this non-complementary kind of system where like basically the colonized land is, there are settler garrisons or colonizer garrisons like very much deep within the colonized, compartmentalized area. And that really like he talks about how like, in the colonizers like compartments, basically, they don't really have to have like police or, military basically constantly surveilling people, but as opposed to the colonized world where the only interactions you have with the colonizer is like the police or like the soldier that brutalizes you day in and day out. And it's beyond kind of the superstructure. Like the superstructure is very much the act of violence that's enacted on the colonized, as well as like the kind of this systemic violence that kind of is kind of outlined that he kind of touches on. I think a thing that is interesting about what he talks about, he's talking about Algeria and also his experience and Martinique, but I think, and also France, but I think within like the United States context, there is very much a compartmentalized world, like the world that we live in, especially the Bay Area specifically. But I think it's very much an experience all throughout, for at least the majority of the United States, at least I guess more of the coastal regions. There are like ethnic enclaves, right? There are people that are kind of, compartmentalized in their, Chinatowns, their Japan towns, or their Latin American quarters. Or even like their new African quarters, specifically, we see that kind of within. the United States, like in the Bay Area with, West Oakland, predominantly Black, New African area is kind of like cordoned off and kind of surrounded by uh, not just like police stations and all that kind of stuff, but also like surrounded by like Superfund sites, distribution centers, like, freeways, kind of cutting off this kind of compartmentalized world from the rest of the Bay Area and access to stuff. But we do kind of see that, throughout the United States and even like in Canada and other settler colonial, countries, that there is a compartmentalization of colonized people, and it's purposeful to kind of one isolate people, but also I think um, you know it's useful, to kind of a divide and conquer kind of aspect. But yeah, I'm kind of interested to hear y'all's thoughts on like its application, this text, to kind of the things that we kind of see either in the Bay Area or within the United States as a whole.
What I see is how this genocidal US settler state has manufactured the system that has at least two forms of compartmentalization. So, first is what you talked about, what Fanon describes, which we see manifesting today as a stark difference in people's lived experiences and environments. This is the tangible, observable compartmentalization, I guess you could say, that we see clearly in the Bay Area. And I'm thinking about the contrast between East Palo Alto and Atherton, or between East Oakland and the Oakland Hills. And second is the compartmentalization that often subconsciously arises among the oppressed here in the US and internationally in response to ongoing repression and trauma. I think it's a form of disassociation, disconnection in thoughts and reality, almost like a fracturing of the mind that can come about as a self-preservation mechanism. It shuts off access to the parts of ourselves that know something's wrong, but either as a result of trauma we've experienced directly or seen others experience. And Fanon describes this as well, right? When he talks about how the rage and envy the colonized feel towards the colonizers is directed internally or against your own people. And I think this really is evident to me in the world of incarceration, specifically in the pre-sentencing world, where survival sometimes translates to further internalizing the logics of carcerality and of punishment and of redemption to survive this racist, ableist, and violent system. Seeing how the mind flails to make sense of these inhumane, genocidal legal procedures, because facing the reality of the situation can be so devastating and reality shattering. And even if you somehow distance yourself from the system, which we know isn't really something that happens, you're left with the psychological damage that comes from redirecting the anger you have towards the system internally, which again is something that Fanon talks about, even when he references like the magical superstructure and those kinds of things.
I would add on to that to say that I think compartmentalization isn't limited only to the native, and and it's also not limited strictly to those who have experienced trauma under these situations, right? Although that is definitely the case. But I think that there's something about this compartmentalization, particularly this geographic compartmentalization, that really fundamentally um, alter alters the way that people understand how the world works. It fundamentally sort of, what's the term? It fundamentally shapes the way that people see the world. And the fact is that when the colonial world is so dependent on the colonized world economically, but aren't geographically proximate enough to be able to actually understand how these things work, they're never able to neither side is really able to fully understand the political economy of the whole, right? Like this is very different from what, you might have experienced in industrial London or something like that in the early 19th century, right? Where it's much clearer how economy works as a whole, right? You take a stroll through different quarters of London and you get a sense of, okay, so this part of London does this part of London does that, et cetera, et cetera. But this more wholesale compartmentalization obscures the political economy of colonialism. Yeah. So sorry for being a little bit long-winded, but that's my ultimate point. And as far as how this applies to our world today, I think that compartmentalization is, um, in the way that Fanon describes it, is really a precursor to the sort of atomization and the compartment and the yeah, to the sort of atomization and compartmentalization that we see as a feature of post-Fordism. And I don't want to get too much into post-Fordism, but a big part of that is this segmentation of the world into consumer markets, this segmentation of populations into consumer markets. And so you can see uh, increasing partitions between people, right? And there's geographic compartmentalization, as Geraldo touched on, but there's also increasingly compartmentalization in online spaces and so on. I don't like to use the word polarization because polarization typically implies that there's two sides, when that isn't really the case. I think Fanon's use of compartmentalization is a much more apt metaphor. But yeah, did anyone have further thoughts on compartmentalization?
Yeah, I think like with regards to like compartmentalization and kind of touching on a little bit of kind of the modern day kind of yeah, the kind of internet sphere of compartmentalization is interesting because we definitely kind of see a little bit of that kind of playing out, with the discussions of motives for, people like the Charlie Kirk assassination. There's all these like, vying groups trying to point fingers at a specific compartmentalized, segment of the internet. Um, I do see some of that, and especially, within social media spheres as well. There's definitely a kind of compartmentalization. Even like the quote unquote leftists, social media sphere is its own compartmentalized, like kind of cordoned off section of the internet, as also the kind of the right wing and the liberal spheres. You don't really have to interact with each other. But I do think, you did kind of bring up a good point. Is like that this compartmentalized world, like in terms of superstructure, does definitely affect like the colonized, but also deeply affects the colonizer not being able to see that kind of political economy. And we do see that today where there are large segments of kind of this kind of, especially within the white, like petite bourgeois, labor aristocratic, like populations where there is this kind of they don't see the whole picture of the effects of their existence and their consumerism, which kind of leads to kind of kind of a false consciousness towards social democracy and somewhat, I guess, kind of like revisionist kind of observation of like the United States as like a progressive, slowly progressive like country, and kind of negates like the concept of colonialism, like not only internally but also externally as well. Um, I do see that kind of affects not just like, the white Euro-American like labor aristocracy, but also like, the colonized, colonized labor aristocracy as well, kind of seeing the United States as like this kind of slow progression towards freedom and independence and if we just vote the right people in, we'll actually, achieve, actual existing social democracy in the United States or something. And we kind of see that, kind of playing out a little bit in New York with Mamdani a little bit, as well as we saw that, in the Bay Area and beyond, with Barbara Lee and some other candidates as well. So I do kind of see kind of like the colonized does experience some level of kind of an being unableness to be able to kind of see the fullness of of the effects of colonization. And it always kind of tends to negate like colonization in general and kind of pushes forward a kind of reactionary politic.
Yeah, yeah. Mamdani released that terrible statement recently after the ceasefire. I don't know if both of y'all read that.
No, I haven't. I didn't have a chance now.
It's just some bullshit about like, oh, like October 7th was a terrible massacre orchestrated by the Hamas terrorists, whatever. It's like indistinguishable from like Marjorie Taylor Greene would have probably crafted a better statement.
Yeah, and that's a perfect example because he also went on Univision, basically Miami alt-right Latin American Spanish-speaking news agency, news in quotations, talking about how Venezuela is an evil dictatorship and basically, pushing for like an imperialist like destruction of Venezuela. Um, yeah, that's a perfect example of kind of that as well.
Yeah, seeing the Mamdani statement kind of first thing that morning that he released it was surprising and unsurprising. I think it has been one thing we talked about, I think, in this last reading group or maybe the week before, was how he has begun to re-illusion a lot of people, um, and kind of um, make people feel like electoralism could potentially be the thing that saves us all. And I think statements like the one that came out last week are a very important reminder, that fascism is reform and reform is fascism. And things that we already kind of knew, we've seen his type, the DSA leaders, Bernie Sanders, AOC, everyone's slightly building on top of their predecessor, but always coming kind of to the same Zionist rhetoric that they peddle while at the same time kind of doing what they need to do to um, secure the votes that they need to win.
Yeah, I'll admit I was a little bit surprised. I mean, I think that Mamdani should definitely not be evaluated in terms of like being some sort of socialist savior for New York or wherever. I think his election or his, maybe he won't get elected. I don't know. We'll see with Cuomo in the mix now, but it's more of a it's if anything more of a bellwether for how things are going. But it's definitely like, even as he promises all of these economic benefits to the citizens of New York, I think Geraldo's point does come to mind again. A lot of the union movement revival that we've seen in the last 5 years, uh, there's an international analysis that's completely missing, and for good reason. Like I don't expect the union, like these unions, especially like, the Lockheed Martin union or the Raytheon union or whatever, to openly be like, well, our members get paid a lot more than, people doing similar work uh in Bangladesh because of the strength of the US dollar. So actually ultimately we do want to support US hegemony. Like that's not that's I mean, none of them are going to come out with that analysis, and it's pretty clear why they nobody wants to say that out loud, but it's definitely on everybody. It's on the minds of some people, at least in the higher ranks, I'm sure of it.
Yeah, kind of we're kind of getting a little bit into some other aspects of this chapter kind of on, I mean, I guess in general, like on concerning violence, he kind of lays out kind of the thesis for the whole book, but he does spend some time, even though he's going to spend more time later in the text on um the wily intellectual, the neo-colonialized intellectual. Um, and I do think that's a really important thing he does touch on because he does touch on kind of like this dialectic between like the wily intellectual who is unwilling to learn from kind of the current conditions of things, or the other intellectual that's kind of forced upon them when they're sent out to the countryside and forced to, survive basically. Um, and I think James Jackie Stiles also kind of touches a little bit on this a little bit too, kind of talking about how there's never really a discussion or an understanding, even within people that aren't, in the labor aristocratic class, so to speak. Um, people that, are immiserated through, internal neocolonialization. Um, that, there is a kind of a need for continued class suicide and a continued need to like understand that even like colonized people are still like afflicted with like petty bourgeois like ideology, but also like consumerism, and that their poverty is not what it would be if they didn't get 1,000 different ways to benefit from the spoils and exploitations of peoples throughout the world. And that he notes on page 88, our passivity wouldn't be what it is if not for our thinking that we have something to lose. And he really touches a little bit on this as well as how like bourgeois liberalism has basically influenced a lot of like people, a lot of the population from, colonized folks who are immiserated all the way to, neo-colonized, colonized folks, etc. To 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 not really kind of want to do anything beyond kind of unionism or working within the confines of either like Democrat, like 50-51 type protest movements or even other protest movements that are more, still liberalized, but kind of call themselves radical in some way, shape, or form. So yeah, because, kind of going into that, the kind of discussion about the wily intellectual and kind of, how that kind of plays out in this chapter.
This makes me think about the importance of James Yakisao's bringing in kind of dialectical materialism and the importance of dialectics when thinking about, I mean, he's writing this book for many reasons. One of those reasons coming from a deep sense of frustration at how Wretched has been co-opted and misinterpreted and marketed by these sort of, I don't even know if he would call them armchair revolutionaries. And one thing that he writes that these people kind of fall into is that they're constantly trying to kind of market Wretched and in some ways reinvent the wheel, right? There isn't a focus on the masses, on building the bases, on becoming one with the people, on learning from past lessons. And that's where this dialectical significance comes in, right? Dealing with the past as a part of shaping the future. And like you said, a lot of people here are very consumerist. We feel like we have too much to lose. We won't advocate for real revolution. And I do think that it feels like there is a disconnect between, you have these kind of wily intellectuals who are really good at selling revolution and writing books and making it very, I guess, palatable and enticing, but not in a way that necessarily enacts any material change because the people that you are reaching have a lot more to lose than the people for whom these programs should be being created for. Um yeah, so I'm just kind of thinking about how, when we don't understand how to like connect with people who have internalized this mindset, it becomes very difficult because you kind of start to stray away from focusing on concrete conditions.
Yeah, to take a slightly negative perspective, I think both of y'all brought up how uh, there's a lot of people in the US in the Imperial Core who have a lot to lose, right? And I just think that it's generally going to be the case that these people are never going to be on the side of the revolution, and it may be like futile even to really try, in my opinion. just because you may convince a few people here and there, but generally people like masses behave in accordance, in alignment with their economic incentives. So like when we talk about like the union movement here, when we talk about people like even Mamdani or somebody like that, uh, I it's kind of a fool's errand to uh to try to convince them to actually embrace some form of internationalism, quote unquote, right? And it's not to say that they won't, say things about internationalism, workers of the world unite or whatever. It's just that, when it comes to actually doing things, I think I mean, these organizations will generally settle for having more dollars printed out for them. Just because, I mean, how are they not going to settle? Right? I mean, that's like, maybe they might not settle for like a 5% raise, but they'll settle for like a 15% raise. Um, and like the money machine go brr. There's not really, yeah, any much downside until dollar hegemony is broken anyways. And once that happens, then we might see some movement from unions here.
Yeah, I think I kind of think of like the conditions here have to worsen to a point where people actually have to kind of reckon with the fact that their quality of life is never going to be the same. Um, and that's kind of, obviously that's very much a very difficult thing to say, like, but it's true. Like people are still, at least in the United States, like are very much consumeristic, very much dependent on the cheap commodities that they can get that, were created through the exploitation of the third world. And once those conditions kind of develop where they can no longer have access to those things and things become worse, then there is definitely the terrain is definitely going to change where there is going to be a necessary like need to organize around something. And now that kind of brings into the question of kind of like, the false consciousness or, whatever what we want to call it of where, where do these people go? And typically, at least with the development of like the United States, I think, we definitely see like right wing kind of reactionary, you know, um, politic is kind of the natural trajectory where people want to go, as opposed to kind of a left-wing perspective on things. Even to some degree, some of the left-wing perspectives are just pseudo right-wing perspectives, just let's paint it with red paint, or like an anarchist symbol or whatever, or a hammer and sickle or whatever. But yeah, I think, Fanon does touch on a lot of this. And I think, he does kind of, we do see a lot of what he's talking about, and at least on concerning violence, like the contradictions between the compartmentalized world and kind of the effects of it psychologically on both the colonizer and colonized. Like we do see kind of like these aspects of concerning violence playing out and like exacerbating through contradictions. Um, yeah, I think yeah, any other additional thoughts on kind of current conditions and kind of class society within the core. Um,
Let, let me just quickly put it this way, then I'll hand it off to Raju. I think, we are, or not we maybe, but the US is an empire. It has been an empire for the last, at least 80 years, if not for all of its history, really. And being an empire comes with like an imperial political economy. Um, so when people try to fix things, I mean, and things will get worse, right? This is not being an accelerationist. This is just like how things are going to shape up, right? Things are going to get worse, and uh, what's going to be more natural, right? What's going to come more easily? Is it going to be rewiring the entire American economy? Like even like Trump can't even like reshore a single factory. Or is it going to be, well, we already have all these bombs, we already have all these troops, we already have Palantir or whatever, so maybe we just double down on the empire stuff. I think, ultimately a lot of like, Democrats, leftists, they may not put it that way, but that's eventually where a lot of people are going to get funneled into because, well, maybe that's the one way Americans do get free healthcare.
I don't want to take us too drastically in a different direction, but I think this conversation has me thinking a lot about strategy, strategy as Fanon discusses in Wretched, and then also kind of what we're seeing today. And one thing that has been reflected back to me as I reread Wretched and Meditations for this reading group is the role of revolutionary violence. Violence is this cleansing force and kind of revolutionary love, which he doesn't, explicitly say, but there's that sentiment has been coming through to me very clearly because what Fanon and Yaki really get at is how decolonization is ultimately about building a new consciousness among the oppressed. And while the initial stages of revolutionary violence can have a spontaneous nature, they're also indicative of an internal transformation that has been taking place potentially for generations, depending on the time period. And I think both of you kind of touched upon some of the factors here that lead to, maybe people being more inclined towards being right wing than left wing, et cetera. And one thing I've been thinking about is how this internal transformation has been experienced and written about by other revolutionaries. And I immediately thought of George Jackson and Sophia Bukhari. And at first, I was just going to paraphrase what they said, but they both wrote it so well. So I have what they wrote here. George Jackson writes in Blood in My Eye, for the slave, revolution is an imperative, a love-inspired, conscious act of desperation. It's aggressive. It isn't cool or cautious. It's bold, audacious, violent, an expression of icy, disdainful hatred. And Sophia Bukhari writes in The War Before, the hard, painstaking work of changing ourselves into new beings, of loving ourselves and our people, and working with them daily to create a new reality. This is the first revolution, that internal revolution. And both of these quotes to me really compliment Fanon and Yaki. And I think they highlight a side of this first chapter of Wretched that is often overlooked, which is that revolutionary violence inherently has this life-affirming side to it. I think, one thing Yaki writes is how much like this, concerning violence is misquoted, and we can see here how it's co-opted by a lot of anarchists. But revolutionary violence, I think, as Fanon writes, reflects this fundamental reorientation of the colonized towards curiosity, I think, curiosity of their own humanity, curiosity of the material and psychological impacts of their oppression, curiosity about their communities. And revolutionary violence is the cleansing force that allows this curiosity to be expressed and propels these movements forward.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point, and especially with regards to the title of the chapter concerning violence. I think, Yaki even touches on this. He just says like the text, people focus on the word violence, but don't focus on what he talks about by the use of all means to enact decolonization. And for Yaki, he touches on that like it's not just about like picking up the gun, and he talks about how like that kind of preemptive like thought of just picking up the gun, going to violence, in that sphere really was very detrimental, at least in terms of his understanding of like the 60s and 70s, as well as other kind of premature revolutionary movements that took up the gun but did not have a holistic program that targeted not just political violence but also had programs for sociological uh, 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 superstructural economic and cultural aspects of revolution. Like the program has to be holistic, not just like revolutionary violence. Like though I think like a lot of organizations, at least in the 60s, at least in the 70s, kind of the paramilitary guerrilla movements like the BLA and other underground, I think they, definitely they had the culture and they definitely had the political violence and they did have connections with the on the ground work. But there was definitely a disconnect with like connecting that together. And by the time, a lot of that happened, the movement was already collapsing from under them. And I do think like with regards to the program that that Yaki talks about, like has to be holistic. I do think like a really big thing with like especially revolutionary love, and I think this is kind of a thing that we see in the modern day, like kind of a lack of a revolutionary love, I guess, so to speak. Like there is like this, and I think that for right reasons, like there are people that have like a disdain for like intellectualism and kind of like people who are intellectual or like who are in revolutionary organizations and are, intellectual. And I do think like there is a downside for people that do not like, meet people where they're at and kind of, bring them to a higher level. But I do think Yaki brings up a good point on page 192, is kind of reflecting on the intellectual darkness phase of the phrase, but also kind of the phase of like the colonized world and how like you know the revolutionary program has to do away with kind of the conventional Western Euro-American idea that ordinary people can't be, or shouldn't be intellectual. He states, get away from the idea that only certain people or groups can be intellectual and think about everyone as an intellectual. Even go back to the first paragraph of the text and reflect on that question about the social structure being changed from the bottom up and connect this to the need for all people to develop and exercise their mental capacities in effect to solve the theoretical and practical problems of their society. And I do think like that is, a really important thing he kind of touches on is that like we have to bring people up ideologically, but also like culturally, spiritually to some degree, especially within his context, um, through that revolutionary love. And that has to be done through a holistic program, beyond just kind of like revolutionary violence, which a lot of people kind of like see it and then don't really engage with the text further than that. But yeah, Dob, if you have any thoughts on kind of some of the things we were just discussing.
Yeah, I think it is interesting that later on in chapter one, Fanon sort of hints at the fact that sometimes when you get this sort of runaway violence or that quickly snowballs out of control, you get independence relatively quickly, and then the natives end up um sort of asking themselves, okay, what do I do now, right? And there's always this expectation that with the end of formal colonization, even without a neo-colonial leader, let's say, there's still so much work left to be done. There's still this um, internal conflict to be had, this battle for the soul of the nation, so to speak. Um, what we usually learn about as a class struggle for the national identity, but um, yeah, I mean, I think that uh Fanon's great strength in this book is tracing the origin, the psychological origin of violence, and then connecting it to the various ways, the sort of multifarious ways that movements can unfold, right? He traces out all these possible trajectories. And a lot of the bad outcomes, so to speak, result from exactly what you're talking about, Geraldo. This lack of structure, this lack of organizational structure, this sort of maybe even I wouldn't say a lack of theory, but a lack of maybe a lack of an attempt to systematize the situation that they're under. Um, yeah. I will say, since now we're talking about a section of it towards the end of this chapter here. He talks a little bit about what happens in the post-colonial era. He talks about like neutralism and things like that. Yeah, I wonder if maybe folks wanted to comment on that a little bit because I think it has a lot to do with what you're talking about, Geraldo. Like, the way that these revolutionary societies are structured post-revolution. And this might actually happen to be one of the main points on which I disagree with Fanon a little bit, but I'd love to hear y'all's thoughts first. I'll find the exact quote that I'm talking about here. I think on pages 79 to 80 or 81, 82 or some sorts. I think this actually has a lot of applications to the current um, geopolitical climate. There's plenty to be said on the subject of neutralism, bottom of page 81. Some equate it with a sort of tainted mercantilism, which consists of taking what it can get from both sides. In fact, neutralism, a state of affairs created by the Cold War, if it allows underdeveloped countries to receive economic help from both sides, does not allow either party to aid underdeveloped areas to the extent that is necessary. Those literally astronomical sums of money which are invested in military research, those engineers who are transformed into technicians of nuclear war, could in the space of 15 years raise the standard of living of underdeveloped countries by 60%.
Yeah, I'm kind of thinking it through a little bit. Yeah, this neutralism that he kind of talks about, especially with regards to like the Cold War. I think, the Cold War is very much is a unique situation in terms of I guess he's kind of touching on kind of the developing kind of non-aligned movement that kind of is starting to develop. That a lot of these kind of post-colonial governments kind of fell into.
Yeah, yeah, and to be clear, I think a lot of people have the same view of multipolarity today, which I think is different from the Cold War situation. But yeah,
Yeah, I guess yeah, because today we see the polarity is kind of, you're either with the West, which is like the United States, Western Europe, Israel, or you're with the East, which is Russia, Iran, and China. Um, I have aversions to states that kind of are trying to revive this kind of like so I guess so to speak kind of a non-aligned movement where they take from both the West and the East, so to speak, in terms of the poles. Um, because I have very much doubts that there's any real use of like continuing to work within that kind of framework, at least economically within like the United States like sphere. Because as we've seen like with countries like
Turkey.
yeah, Turkey is one. Yeah, Turkey where where they're kind of basically just a comprador state for like, they try to, pose themselves as like anti-Israel, anti the West or whatever, but basically they're just like uh 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 a military base for the United States and its comprador elites, right? Which then, kind of trickled into what we saw with Syria, which was more aligned with like the East, so to speak. Um, and total immiseration of the country by HTS and Jolani, and now it's totally in a vassal state of of the United States and Israel. Yeah, so Turkey, yeah, is very much a key example of that. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say also um, Saudi Arabia for sure. Most of the Gulf states, in fact.
Yeah, I think I can't think of a state, at least in terms of like that's in terms of yeah, because I think the only real state that has had a recent revolution in terms of changing the kind of social dynamic is like Ansar Allah in Yemen, and they are more or less li aligned with Iran and the West. Um, Not the West, I mean the East. Um, yeah, I think like, we definitely see the Gulf states, I definitely see, um, you know, even within the Western Hemisphere, like we see kind of Brazil kind of towing the line, a little bit with like its invasions of Haiti, but also kind of its kind of quote unquote pink tide, so to speak, in that country. Yeah, I think, the non-aligned movement is no longer kind of a reality in the current day, I think. And that's something that, Fanon maybe did not have the chance to kind of observe that, the fall of the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, and the Eastern Bloc countries would create a new reality where and a new social dynamic where the United States basically like overcomes um, majority of the world until Eastern countries kind of develop and are able to create a new pole, so to speak. Um,
Well, you know
yeah,
who is a big proponent of non-alignment? I mean, China for sure, right? China is basically like I think actually China might even be almost alone on this. Kind of the sole um, proponent of this of this type of world order, you know. But yeah, like whatever happens with that, I guess we'll see. I think a lot of it traces its legacy back to this particular period of time that they're talking about in Wretched, right? And it actually it's quite an evocative plateau uh that Fanon describes sometimes, right? You have, you know, Khrushchev in the UN General Assembly slamming his shoe on the podium or whatever. It's just very interesting to imagine. I think you're in the UN General Assembly, you know, a good third to like a half of the member states there are all newly socialist republics. Yeah, very interesting time. So different from how we perceive the UN General Assembly now.
with with regards to kind of the changing conditions for what Fadal was talking about, like at least with an on-the-line movement to today, I think a big thing that we see, at least, at the time of recording this podcast, we're like a couple of days out from the ceasefire in Gaza. And that has illuminated a lot, at least in terms of like, there was like, I think the Cradle came out with a expose about how like the Gulf states were colluding with like the genocide and kind of continuing to prolong it uh, to this point, as well as some other like articles that kind of came out like touching on like how deep the collaborationist kind of groups within Gaza that Israel and some of the Gulf states were kind of utilizing to kind of sow discord and destruction in Gaza, further facilitating the genocide. And I think, with Fanon in this text, we do see kind of, this development of like a new world, a new society, at least with regards to like, the resistance factions within Gaza, that have been able to survive and kind of continue to create, a sense of stability even despite, the ongoing genocide. And still have, services for people. As opposed to kind of, this kind of false nationalistic comprador states that kind of are pushing for, the complete subjugation of Gaza as like a resort or whatever for Arab elites. And I think that's something we did talk about quite a bit, and I think it would have been cool if we could touch on that a little bit more because we didn't really get deeper into that within the last reading group, kind of its relation to Gaza, the ceasefire, and kind of um, and kind of what's next from that and kind of its relation to Fanon.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm thinking about this question. But like I don't know. I mean, I just want to say that I don't know if y'all both saw those pictures of, Hamas riding out in the streets after the ceasefire, so defiant, so based. It's pretty badass. Um, yeah, I mean, what does it have to do with fun? I mean, it has like everything to do with Fanon, really, but I don't know. Raju, do you want to comment on it real quick?
Yeah, sorry, I just need like a minute. I'm still putting some thoughts together.
Yeah, I mean, I think um so moving forward, what's going to happen? I mean, I would like to hope that it doesn't stay as a sort of stalemate, down the line. I would also like to not see the ceasefire broken either. I mean, what I think is that Israel, this settler colonial entity, is really has really been so spiritually weakened by this war that I think it's sort of a matter of time. Like anybody with big investments in that country must be thinking about diversifying at this point, right? I mean, it takes time to diversify, right? And once they lose that, then it's kind of game over for the Israelis. Um, and yeah, I would hope that in due time, you know, maybe we'll see something from Egypt, from Jordan, maybe not. I mean, who knows how deep the comprador elite go in those countries, but I still think there's definitely opportunity there.
Yeah, I think, with regards to, at least regards to concerning violence, I think like the ceasefire definitely was a strategic failure, at least in terms of the Zionist entity, like in terms of like ideologically, culturally, economically, like the resistance factions like won in terms of at least like they still have like, you know, they're still like basically the army of the people, so to speak. Like they are like the really the the arbiters of like of resistance against basically what the United States and Israel want is kind of, a comprador Palestinian authority. And I do think like it very much plays out in the Fanon. Like, they talk about how like Fanon talks about in this chapter how they just want to rush to, the green table, or I think he says something like rushing to the green table to negotiate to just kind of end this all, before the bloody battle starts. Which, definitely was not kind of what happened, at least with regards to like Oslo. Like there was definitely a bloody battle before it, but it definitely, was going to go and illuminate into it to something higher, to a higher stage. But Oslo definitely, led to that, the negotiations and comprodorization and kind of neocolonization of like the West Bank, and the resistance factions. Well, an alternative to that is kind of what Fanon talks about, in an alternative that actually, goes deeper than kind of neocolonialism, and a neocolonial elite. But we'll see, I we can only hope that it doesn't end up, in Oslo 2.0. And I doubt that it would lead to that, at least with regards to like the resistance factions all agreeing upon it. But yeah, I think there's a lot of parallels, and I guess there's a lot of gray area that we won't really know until we know.
You know who's been great in all of this? Greta Thunberg. Like exemplary white person right there. Like I actually would not be surprised if the whole like flotilla thing was like one of the like a driving factor behind the ceasefire, it would make a lot of sense to me that that having that ceasefire in the works is, you know, they sent what Spain and Italy and Greece sent warships. I thought they completely like chickened out, right? Like they like backed off, but a few days later there was a ceasefire. So,
I think one question that I'm having in all of this is just tying it back to like within the context of the so-called US, how certain decisions within movements are critiqued, what works, what doesn't work. Because I'm thinking even in terms of the flotilla, um, here in Oakland, seeing a lot of the organizing around that, I remember seeing a lot of critiques of like, oh, this is kind of for show, like, this isn't whatever mass work, all of these things. And there's a really, there's a real likelihood that this contributed, Dob, like you said, to this ceasefire. So yeah, I guess I just something that I'm thinking about is how quickly people can rush to critique certain actions, um, and that can, I think, lead to a little bit of tunnel vision in terms of, okay, this approach is just automatically out, it's not going to work. But then on the other hand, seeing how more, I guess, demonstrative acts can also be very subversive. Yeah, I don't know if that makes sense, but I've just been, I think, hyper aware of seeing how people have been critical about tactics that work and have been very embracing of tactics that have kind of failed.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. I think a thing that I guess like the Western left, this how small that is. There is, because we're kind of inundated with this like need to be on top of like the next best thing or the next, talking point. And I think like everyone on the left, even if you're not in the United States or, elsewhere, like critique in good time. And sometimes you just have to watch and see how things play out. Um, to some degree. Like there are some degrees where there are some, actions that do need to be critiqued, like, pretty much instantly. I think with regards to kind of CLP's political line is like anything regarding like electoralism is something that needs to be critiqued. But something like the flotilla, like I think critique in good time, like these, like especially like this recent flotilla like attempt, like they got really close, and not only that, they were like tortured and like beaten and like forced them to like kiss like the flag of Israel, as well as like watch like 72 hours worth of like October 7th propaganda, like absolutely like disgusting like torture that this like heinous like fake pseudo state is enacting on people. And I think like a lot of the criticisms was kind of like, not in good time and not in good taste. Um, but I do think like, at least within locally, and I think this is kind of locally within anywhere in like the United States, Western Europe, etc. Like I guess it kind of just depends, like, what the tactics are to actually enact change. And I think like there also has to be kind of a sitting with reality with a lot of people within the core, like that a lot of the actions that are done here really mean very little in stopping the genocide, in Gaza. Like in terms of like, some of the direct action stuff, even some of like the campaigns to target specific weapon manufacturers or logistics companies, like realistically, like there was a kind of a lack of like seriousness that a lot of people didn't take, and kind of take it to heart what Cabral says, like, claim no easy victories, and claiming easy victories and like saying like, oh, Maersk does not has stopped sending stuff to Israel without actually talking about the reason why they did that was because Iran during the 12-day war was pounding Israel with missiles that were just totally destroying their economic base. That would make it unfeasible for for transportation and logistic companies to even want to like deliver goods and services to that, to that little, fake, ethno state. Um, but yeah, I think like people need to, and then Fanon talks about this, like, critique in good time, but also like claim no easy victories. Like we cannot like tell lies to the people and tell lies to ourselves to make it seem like we're doing more than we really are. Um, and that's something we have to take to heart. And that's kind of like the ugly reality of like organizing in the core. At least that's kind of some of my thoughts on kind of what you're talking about, Raju.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought this up, Raju, because I think that this is this really does get to the core of how we should be reading, or um yeah, one way in which we can be reading Fanon. I think a lot of his observations are just that. It's sort of like, there's a point where there's a time for us to sit back and observe and to carefully, understand the way that things are unfolding. And I'm guilty of a lot of this myself. I think for some time I was like skeptical of the effects of a lot of things. Like for example, like the 2020 protests, a lot of people may still kind of be dismissive of its effects. And I think that it hasn't had a lasting impact on any sort of liberation movement, but what it has done is undeniably advance the US towards a more revolutionary situation. And I think that's the other thing. I think we do need to partition um, the time that the times that we're in between a, let's say, pre-revolutionary situation and a revolutionary situation. I think that when we are in a revolutionary situation, such as, the time that Fanon was writing in, it is very important for us to, work hard to derail any attempts at electoralism, right? If to push the contradictions to the point where uh, the violent overthrow of the system is the only option, right? But in a pre-revolutionary situation, I think that actually a lot of the shenanigans that get played by both of the parties and by like other political forces in the US, and this is not an endorsement of either the Democrats or the Republicans, but just to say that a lot of the shit that they pull, it actually just advances the contradiction further. It actually brings us closer to a revolutionary situation. And I think that it is an open question. How do we work around that? How do we work with that? Should we push them in ways that heighten the revolutionary situation? Because I think you can definitely, yeah, I think you can definitely see how through their own internal contradictions, you have these uh, these different parties ultimately sowing the seeds of their own destruction. Yeah. Should we or should we not accelerate that? What do you all think? By the way, one of the things I'm referring to is I think in a few days, like maybe like 5 days or something, there's supposed to be a huge, like, the biggest ever 50-51 protest or whatever. I'm sure something's going to happen. And it'll further deepen the polarization, et cetera, et cetera.
This doesn't directly answer your question, but kind of the last thought I'm having is one of, to me, the most obvious manifestations of liberalism in leftist movements is this desire to kind of this like spontaneous reactionary energy, right? We need to do something and we need to see results now, and we want to feel like everything that we're doing is making a difference, and that can lead to, I mean, a lot of things, right? Co-optation, et cetera. And at the same time, as organizers and even as people like leading this reading group, I think, in the Imperial Core, that is something to strategize around because we do see organizations, I won't name any names in the Bay Area that are very good on capitalizing on that energy and kind of putting people on this hamster wheel. And so I guess I just kind of struggle with how to kind of shatter this bubble that Geraldo you were talking about and this delusion that a lot of people here have about the direct impact of certain actions, um, and kind of reconcile that with um, people having good intentions and wanting to show up and learn and um, yeah, self-correct. So I think that's something that's been sitting with me for a while.
Yeah, I'm sure they wouldn't mind if if we said if we named names, right? I mean, everybody knows like DSA, PSL, these different socialist so-called parties that run electoral campaigns. I mean, it is my opinion that they certainly serve a particular niche in the movement as a whole. Currently, we are definitely not in any sort of revolutionary situation yet. Although, I don't know, a few more Charlie Kirks and maybe we'll see something change. But yeah, what do you all have to say about these electoral tactics and how they, what does Fanon say about that?
Yeah, I think, Fanon talks about, like, at least in terms of electoral tactics, he talks about how, like, the nationalist parties basically, you know, push for these rights of the colonized, at least at the time, at least in Algeria, like one person, one vote, um, land or bread, to the people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. 'Cause he's kind of economistic asks from the colonizer. And we do see that today, like, and in terms of its relation, we do see that today, especially with like the more settler pseudo socialist organizations like DSA specifically. They push for a line like we want universal health care, we want higher wages, we want a minimum wage that's at least at the time it was 15 an hour, but now it's probably like 25 an hour or something. We want unions in every, job site, and we want less hours to a 40-hour work week, and these are all like economistic asks for from the settler capitalist state that we're currently living under. And like realistically, where is this wealth coming from? It's obviously not coming from like the surplus value that a lot of workers produce here in the core. It's actually being produced by the subjugation and destruction of the third world. Like we're getting a lot of the surplus value from the concentration camp in El Salvador that's, churning out free commodities, with slave labor basically. We see that, with Argentina, with Milei and his basically destruction of his country for, free lithium for the United States. We see that with, Israel, obviously, with the destruction of the whole region of West Asia, but also like areas within Africa. We even see the immiseration of like countries in Europe, especially with the Trump administration, like basically holding up like Western Europe, holding up the Balkans, holding up NATO countries, and holding up like the Asian comprador states like South Korea and Philippines and Japan, to pay the bill for quote unquote reindustrialization in the United States. Um, and that kind of destruction of like basically a large swath, three-fourths of the world to fund electoralism or electoralist economism that the DSAs, PSLs, etc. like push. Does it really make sense to kind of like I don't see the utility and I don't see the utility in like make that it really allows people to think of a better world or conceive of a better world that actually gives them the tools for self-determination. Um, because like realistically, like what does a social democratic or quote unquote socialist candidate really going to do besides, doing the same old things like, Bernie Sanders does. Um, and I think like realistically, the United States as a settler colony, really like the only thing that really matters is land. And the only, national movements towards the development of land and land for the people are the Republic of New Africa and the Black Belt, as well as, the kind of the neo kind of I guess in terms of like, New Africans in the diaspora, they have their own kind of, state that could be developed at least within outside the Black Belt, as well as, indigenous people, right? At least, indigenous people that are, tied to the land and are developing a national consciousness and national culture beyond kind of a comprador um reality. But yeah, I think electoralism ultimately, is not useful. But yeah,
Yeah,
I see Dom.
I will also say really quickly, I think it's funny that a lot of DSA's demands are essentially for like a a welfare state, so to speak, and like welfare, in some ways, like universal healthcare, not a terrible thing, but when you put everything together, what they're basically asking for is like extra vacation, paid for by like workers in the global south, engineers in the global south, etc. I think that once you put those two pieces together, it's pretty funny. And Fanon actually does emphasize heavily that building a socialist economy, building a socialist country is hard work. You should expect that. You shouldn't expect that. Oh, okay. So now that we're socialist, I can have like, 4 days of vacation a week, right? Like I think that's a whole other topic. But yeah, sorry. I'm sure you also have thoughts on electoralism, Raju.
I mean, the last thing I'll say is, like George Jackson says, like if you're choosing between 10 different fascists, you're just choosing which way you'd like to die. And, without kind of oversimplifying, it's really just how long are we going to keep, pushing and buying into the system that is going to allow capitalism to reform, to sustain itself, and just delay the inevitable, what I believe is the inevitable of this all coming down. And, if that means that whoever is elected is more openly fascist and that allows the contradictions to sharpen, as we are seeing today, then that's what it will be.
JD Vance versus Newsom 2028.
I mean, that's kind of what it's kind of looking like what it's going to be.
Vance has no ridge. Vance has no chance. Vance is like like honestly, like if you just put the two of them side by side, yeah.
The TikToker versus the podcaster. We will see who wins in 2028. 2028? Yeah. Um, all right. Well, with that, I think we can kind of start wrapping up. So today we talked a lot about concerning violence. We talked about the concept of the compartmentalized world. We talked about revolutionary violence and kind of its misunderstandings, as well as revolutionary love, as well as its relations to the current movements in the core and imperial core, as well as, geopolitics and political tactics and strategy within the United States and the settler colony. And so, with that, I hope this conversation was very illuminating for folks listening in, especially for folks that are tapping in with our reading group. So, with that, we will start wrapping it up. So, I'm going to do the outro now. So, this was episode 6 of Wretched of the Earth, kind of supplemental information and supplemental discussion, which is a podcast by Community Liberation Podcasts. We have been your hosts, Geraldo, Raju, and Dob. Catch us on the ground on Instagram at Community Liberation Programs, and we will see you at the reading group or elsewhere. All right, see y'all later.